We have Lis Meyers from Banyan Global, Branka Minic from Futurework Consulting, and Sameer Raina from Digital Divide Data, and Twisha Mehta from Samosource. And we apologize to Twisha, who flew in from San Francisco last night, somewhat last minute, to join this panel. Samosource felt so passionately about being here, and we're very thankful to have you. But we don't have your photo up there. There you go.
Start by framing the research a bit, and then I'm going to talk about some of the key findings from the report, some of the benefits we found in implementing Microwork through an impact sourcing approach, and then I'm going to pass the conversation on to Branka, who's going to highlight some of the challenges as well as the solutions. And throughout this, we intended to be a dialogue, so we'll be asking both Twisha and Sameer to give us some reactions, examples, and add some rich detail from the implementer perspective. So just to frame all of this research, we started with a literature review that involved analysis of over 90 documents, including academic papers, donor reports, annual reports from many of the impact sourcers we included in our research. And then we did 40 stakeholder consultations, including 14 interviews with 6 different Microwork and impact sourcing implementers. We also interviewed 4 companies in the crowdsourcing BPO industry, including Cloudflower. And then we did a number of client interviews with Getty Images, who we just saw up here, Intuit, Microsoft, eBay, Pinterest, University of San Francisco, and several others. And we also interviewed donors involved in this space, including MasterCard Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation. Just to quickly summarize what we just saw in that video. So microwork or microtasking is a facet of the online outsourcing industry in which large projects can be deconstructed in more simple, repetitive tasks that can be easier to complete. But they do require human judgment. It's not something that can be automated by a computer. So driving traffic to websites, gathering or validating data, transcription, tagging or labeling images, and right now, it's also being used for promoting algorithmic and computer-based learning. So for example, helping to develop the technology behind self-driving cars, helping that car learn what does a pedestrian look like, what does another car look like, what does a road sign look like, how do you identify it, and flagging all those examples, circling all those examples so the computer learns how to drive a car. And microwork, when impacted through an impact sourcing approach, is basically when there's a mission involved. It's not just about providing the job for the client, but it's also about maybe addressing some of the barriers to employment due to gender, disabilities, age, location, for example, living in slums or rural areas, mobility constraints. It focuses exclusively on employing disadvantaged individuals, often in developing countries, but also in the United States, who experience these barriers to employment. And who also experience maybe lack of educational opportunities, lack of viable job opportunities, and poverty. And a key component of impact sourcing is that it focuses not just on producing this high quality work for clients at a reasonable cost, but that it looks at having a positive impact on the workers who are doing the work itself. And so what we sought to do in our research was to examine microwork through this lens of impact sourcing and see what happens when the two combine. And so now I'm going to highlight a few of the key findings in the report, and I encourage everyone to go online and access the full copy of the report. I think the link is available. It's up now, and you can read a lot more findings. It's a pretty long and lengthy report. So one thing that I found really interesting is that a key trend in impact sourcing is that it's framed as a technology solution, business first, and many of the impact sourcing groups out there, like Samosource and like DDD, frame themselves as technology partners first that can solve real business and data problems for clients. And the social mission is the cherry on top. And all implementers have really invested in framing their narrative around this way. And as well as talking to clients, they also said that quality of the input followed by timeliness and cost were the most important considerations in deciding to use impact sourcing approaches over the corporate social responsibility aspect of it. So I'd love to hear from DDD and Samosource your reactions to this and why you've decided to frame your businesses in these matters. Sure. Oh.
me first? All right.
Sure.
So yeah, so just a quick background on DDD. Digital Divide Data, we've been around for 15 years. We started off working in East Asia, primarily in Cambodia and Laos. And we are now in Kenya and now going into Tanzania as well. So basically what we do is, with respect to our clients, I mean, we have about 1,500 people in total. We have a work-study program through which, we hire people from at-risk backgrounds, mostly, with high school education, and then we sponsor them through their college education and then, train them on different skills. And so they earn money while they're getting a degree, and they have employment, and we then outplace them into different roles. So, with our clients, what we found is, yes, the commercial considerations definitely are the key driver. I mean, there's no way around it. The social aspect is there, but that's, from our perspective, we've seen that unless the commercial considerations are met, the social aspect doesn't really sort of come into the discussion. And then, people get excited about the social aspect, and a lot of times we've got our clients also participating on the social side. But then at the end of the day, when you're looking at longer-term relationships, they're driven primarily on the commercial side. And I think that's the model that we found to be quite sustainable. And, for us, at least speaking for DDD, having commercial sustainability as an organization is extremely important to us, so that we're not, having a lot of dependencies on donors and outside third parties. So, so we look at it as a business, run it as a business. It's more challenging, given the areas that we've chosen to operate in compared to much more traditional outsourcers. And, we communicate this to the clients, and clients appreciate us for that perspective.
Well, thanks. So like DDD, SamaSource is an impact sourcing organization. As you saw in the video, we are a nonprofit social enterprise. And so business is at the core of what we do, and the social impact is also very much tied to that business component. For SamaSource, we've been in the industry since 2008. And since 2008, we've successfully trained and hired over 8,000 people across Kenya, Uganda, India, and previously in Haiti to do impact sourcing work for some of the largest Silicon Valley companies in San Francisco, on the East Coast, and even in Europe. And so the core part of our model is hiring disadvantaged or vulnerable youth. And that is really a core part of our organization's mission, is to provide jobs to people that traditionally would never get employed in the technology sector, especially in digital work. So we're sourcing most of our workers from low-income areas in the countries that we work in. Most of our centers are located in urban areas like Nairobi and Kampala. But like in the video that you just saw, we've also tried to see if digital work or impact sourcing can work in rural areas as well. And to prove that concept, we've partnered with Oxfam Novib and the Dutch postcode lottery to bring not only internet to Gulu, Uganda, but to also bring work and prove that this type of model can work in rural locations as well. So for us, the business viability is also very important. And as a social enterprise, I think the biggest goal is to break even. And so we're really excited to say in the last three quarters of 2016, we've not only broken even, but we're able to now be financially sustainable.
Great, thanks. And Sameer touched upon the issue of sustainability, and that's something we also sought to examine in our research. And we found that it's often a bit of a balancing act to provide cost-effective, timely, and high-quality work to clients while also making sure that social mission is addressed, providing quality work while ensuring there's meaningful work for the employees, that there are training opportunities, that there are benefits like scholarships and soft skills training. And many of the implementers started out with donor funding from Rockefeller Foundation and among others. And we also found that some of the for-profit providers out there, they typically have less funding to invest in the mission-oriented aspect of the work. So it's downplayed a little bit. But in recent years, groups like SamaSource and DDD have made some pretty big improvements towards sustainability, relying less and less on donor funding. So I would love to hear from both of you about how you got to that, how you got on that track towards sustainability, and what were some of those key milestones to accomplish increased sustainability.
If you don't mind, I might go first. So for Somasource, when we first started in 2008, it was a pretty new idea to be in the impact sourcing space. And so as organizations and donors were getting excited about this idea, we wanted to prove that, first of all, the model itself was viable and there was a proof of concept. And so after we were able to prove that not only can you train and hire people coming from very low income areas to do complex tasks, big messy data projects for some of the largest Silicon Valley companies, we started garnering clients as well. And so as we started moving towards that operationally sustainable model, donors were able to see that, hey, this is an idea that can not only work on the business side, but has a social impact as well. And it's almost a development intervention in itself. And so we got a lot of funding to do more of what we consider R&D that traditional business costs would not cover. And so from that startup point to getting to the point that we've scaled to today, we've really appreciated that donor investment in helping us get to this point. And I think moving forward, that donor funding will become less and less as the business or the client revenue covers operational costs.
So our story is fairly similar. Slightly different trajectory. So what we also find is that for us, sustainability and scalability go hand in hand. That for us to be really scalable, I mean, we graduate about 400 to 600 students every year through the program, and our challenge for the next 10, 15 years is how do we make our business 100x to where we are. And what we've actually interestingly found is that our donors have started taking us a lot more seriously since the point where we said that, look, we will be commercially sustainable. So we are actually looking to run this as a commercial enterprise and then go to donors and have a business-to-business conversation and say, look, this is a commercially viable model. And not only go to donors, but also look at raising financing and funding in the more traditional sense. That, look, we are a social startup. We want to get to 100x to where we are, and this is a commercial model. It's been proven not only by us, but with other peers as well in the industry. And then look at it from a commercial investment perspective with the whole social paradigm built into it. So we found that once we've demonstrated that yes, we are commercially sustainable, our donors are actually looking at us from a different lens as well. They're more aggressive. They're more challenging us more and more to be more ambitious. They're opening more doors for us. Not only from a revenue perspective, we're getting in new and interesting clients, but also experimenting with different models, giving us more seed money to experiment with different aspects of technology that could be scaled, et cetera. So I think the dialogue and the conversation has started to change from our perspective once we've demonstrated that we're commercially sustainable.
So Sameer, it's like we're on the same wavelength, because the next thing I wanted to talk about was scalability and some of our research findings on scalability. And we found that some implementers, like Cloud Factory and DeProm, they are hoping to scale to new countries. And they named Rwanda, Ghana, and Uganda as a few countries where they think the conditions are right. DDD and Samesource both told us that through trial and error, they prefer to scale within the countries they're already operating on, focusing on hiring additional workers within those countries, and rather than expanding to new regions and countries. But something else that I found really interesting that both DDD and Samesource touched upon was that they hope to provide consulting services to help others take on impact sourcing and Microwork and really help scale the industry in a way that's not just DDD and Samesource doing all the work, but they want there to be more implementers and service providers out there. And so they would help other service providers run their own independent Microwork and impact sourcing operations. And I thought that was really interesting. And for example, I know Samesource is looking at opportunities at how to work with refugee populations in Lebanon and Jordan to do this work. And they did a really interesting pilot in a refugee camp in northern Kenya on the border between Kenya and Somalia. And I thought that was really interesting. And another interesting finding that we found on scalability is that we also see that some more crowdsourcing Microwork implementers like Cloudflower is they're actually getting more involved in impact sourcing too. And so what they're doing is that, this is generally, people just as like an online marketplace, you need work, it goes out to this crowd of independent workers. It's not impact sourcing, but they're starting to partner with different local groups in Kenya and India, like iMerit and DeProm, and they're starting to say to their clients, do you want a more secure channel? Do you want an NDA in place? Do you want a slightly higher quality control at maybe a slightly higher cost? You can use these channels to get the more crowdsourcing based work done, and it will also have this approach on impact. So we found that there's a few different approaches to scalability, and that was really interesting. And I would love to hear more from you, Twisha, about the pilot that you ran or some of your plans to work with refugees, and then Sameer about some of the consulting services you hope to provide.
Definitely, thanks. So in reference to the consulting services, I think that's, both DDD and Samosaurus have learned a lot throughout the years as being practitioners in the space. And so there's a lot of lessons learned, a lot of challenges that we've been able to overcome. And I think, that's something we would love to be able to help other organizations that are looking to get into the space. And one of our core beliefs is really that all boats rise at high tide. And so the more companies that get into impact sourcing, whether it's digital work or other types of work that source from vulnerable populations, that's a win across the global economy. And so what we really want to do is to provide our expertise both as a impact sourcing organization and even on the monitoring and evaluation side. So one of the unique things about Samosaurus is that we are a business, but we're also equally invested in measuring our impact with that academic rigor that traditional nonprofits do. And so just in reference to the consulting services, that's kind of the direction that we want to provide is how do we get there from startup to scale, and what kind of things have to be in place as you're going, what are the milestones as you go along the way. And in terms of the pilots that we've worked on, we've worked with some UN agencies on understanding how can we bring digital work to not just vulnerable populations, but refugee populations. And these are some of the biggest questions of our time today with the crisis in Syria and even other conflicts around the world. And so we did a pilot with refugees in Dadaab to assess, can we bring this type of work? Is it trainable? Is it, is the infrastructure in place? So these are all types of questions that we're asking and answering as we're working with the agencies that are looking to bring this type of work. And so we've tested out in a few different locations. The scope of the work has been varied depending on what the agencies are interested in, but we're really looking forward to figuring out how we can scale this across the board.
Great, Sameer?
Yeah, so from our perspective, a lot of it is still work in progress. So we're still figuring out, what is the magic formula. And we continue to do a lot of trial and error with support from our sponsors, founders, foundations, et cetera. So, our belief is that we want to go deep in the areas that we currently operate in, whether it's Kenya or East Asia, to do a couple of things. One is, how do you support the local and, I would say domestic ecosystem? So the first phase is fine that you've got, Western clients paying for services and, that model. The second thing is, what can you do in terms of an impact at the local level? So what we are experimenting with is that, okay, so DDD has a certain sort of model, a certain formula, and can we sort of encourage entrepreneurship at a local grassroots level by saying, okay, this is a formula, can we establish, say, franchises for this particular model of working connected with the DDD environment in areas that we're not operating. I mean, at the scale at which we are right now, it's a drop in the ocean, okay? So what we believe is that, look, we have some good learning experiences. Can we scale them at a local level, say, instead of probably trying out a new country and then spending a lot of time with the learning curve, et cetera. So our thinking is that, say, if you're operating in Nairobi, can we go to the different counties, work with the local partner institutions through players like the United Nations or the regional county governments, and have that kind of scale plugged into the DDD network. So it's still sort of, I think, early for us. I don't think we have the answer, but that seems to be a direction that seems to be working a lot better than going to a new country, figuring it out, trying to set up operations there.
And the last topic I want to talk about before I hand the floor to Branka is the benefit and the value of microwork when done through an impact sourcing approach. And we found that evidence from various impact sourcing providers supports the theory that microwork, when implemented through this impact sourcing framework, can increase income, it can help workers build new and valuable skills, it can lower costs for clients, it can reduce attrition of workers, and it can also positively affect the communities in which the workers reside. I found it really interesting that a lot of implementers, including Samosource and DDD, view themselves as a bridge, providing much needed economic opportunities for youth and other marginalized and vulnerable populations. It's an introduction to the formal economy. It's an introduction to the technology space. And this allows workers without many opportunities when they're starting to move on to higher education, to move on to another higher paying job, a more technically advanced job. Working at Samosource and DDD is not the end game. It's rather the bridge to a more formal job, a higher paid job, and a more advanced job. And impact studies performed by implementers really support this. Another benefit is also how many impact sourcing providers out there offer very flexible working conditions, full-time, part-time, working at a center, working remotely, and this can be very attractive to mothers, to students, to those with mobility constraints. And Samosource, DDD, and DeProm, another impact sourcing provider, are also targeting women workers specifically. And this is a really fantastic opportunity to bring women into formal employment, and in the tech space in particular, where they're underrepresented. We also found from the business client side that impact sourcing can help companies meet their savings goals, and that it's often pretty comparable to traditional BPO costs in doing business with impact sourcers. And we also found that this workforce attrition rate is also really interesting. It can be 15 to 40% higher worker attrition when done through an impact sourcing approach. So I'd love to hear a little bit more from Sameer and then Twisha on some of the benefits that they're seeing, both looking at the client side, what's the value of the work you're providing, but also the value for the workers involved. And then we'll move to Branka.
Yeah, so like Samosource, we do monitoring and evaluation quite seriously, and we keep tweaking the model based on what we see in the market. So right now, our workforce is 50%. Pretty much split evenly, between the genders. I think a couple of things that we sort of look at from a skill development perspective is, it's our responsibility. We look at it as our responsibility rather to say, okay, what is the next generation digital skills that I can train my sort of teams on that will give them, I would say, at least say the goal is lifetime employability. So, we look at ourselves as just an intervention mechanism where you come in, get trained over a certain set of skills, and then you go on and do, bigger and better things, and we track them over, 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, et cetera. So, we've been doing a couple of very interesting things in terms of just even Microwork is that, we define our next generation skills that we are training people on to be, things around cloud computing, things around data analytics, et cetera, where these are, higher level skills, big mismatch in the global demand and supply. And we believe that, if we are able to train a certain section of people who are not coming from the traditional backgrounds of an engineering or a much more structured education, and we put them through our program, and then they either continue to work with us through 4 years, or they can then go on and do bigger and better things. I mean, our goal is that if we can, use DDD as a platform for these next generation skills that are globally in demand, then, people can have a lot more, I would say, ability to have self-sustainability. I think the challenge that we see is that, fine, after DDD you get a job, but the reality is you're still at the mercy of the job market sooner or later, okay? So over 5 years after graduation, et cetera. So what are the skills that would be extremely sticky and in demand for the job market for the next 5 to 10 years? We touched upon in the previous session about credentialing and certifications, et cetera. So that's what we are actually experimenting with. We have a partnership with Amazon Web Services, where we've launched like the first cloud academy in East Africa, where we're training people who come from non-computing backgrounds. We've deconstructed the training curriculum in a way that makes sense. And then, from our perspective, yeah, if you're a cloud certified, if you're an Amazon certified system administrator around cloud computing, the chances of your job being sticky and your chances of you earning 5 to 10 times more than what you would be making today are quite high. So, we're looking at a lot of different things. The attrition rates, of course, are a big attraction for clients because, like say for us, in the work study program, for 4 years, they are working with us primarily because they're going through their, to the undergraduate program. So that's something that a lot of traditional BPO companies are not able to offer. Our attrition rates are, in many cases, lower than 10%, which are unheard of from a BPO context. So it's very attractive from that perspective as well.
So for SamaSource, I think when we first started, we usually tried to target impact workers, and what we found throughout the years is that if we want to create a deeper impact, we need to go out and reach out to populations that are traditionally not even recruited. And so we actually started what we call SamaSource Digital Basics, a 40-hour boot camp that trains vulnerable youth from low-income areas and gets them even qualified to compete for the jobs that SamaSource does. And so we found that as a very successful model, the training plus employment component. And we've started that training component in the last 2 years. And so we're seeing a lot of success as we're bringing these workers in from low-income areas like Kibera and Nairobi. Kibera is one of the largest slums in Nairobi and Africa, I think, itself. And so being able to have a target population that, first of all, has never been employed in the formal sector is a big challenge. But being able to train, being able to provide both technical and soft skills sets them up for long-term success. As you think about your first job and how that provided a bridge to your next employment and next career opportunity, it works the same with our workers as well. And so we're trying to give them a real-life work experience that not only is about completing the tasks for these large Silicon Valley companies, but it's about providing transferable skills. We provide soft skills, how to communicate across teams, how to develop a sense of professional etiquette, professionalism, et cetera. And so we've found a lot of success in our impact numbers as well. And throughout the years, we've tried to track what happens not just to a worker once they join SamaSource, that pre to during SamaSource impact, but even what happens 1 year, 2 years, 3 years out. And so on average, we're seeing that workers are increasing their income 3.7 times their pre-SamaSource income after 3 years of leaving SamaSource. And we also ask, are people going back into the informal sector? Are they staying in the formal economy? 98% of the people that end up going into further employment are remaining in the formal sector, going into industries such as ICT, finance, accounting. A lot of people have other career aspirations as well, so we don't want to only track them into tech-based jobs in the local economies that we work in. We also encourage them to be able to get jobs in other places, like accounting. A lot of them end up going to nonprofits, using the computer skills that they've gained at SamaSource to then apply across different jobs in Nairobi, Kampala, and all the other geographies we work with. One of the most interesting things about the work that we do is the rigor and the impact. And I think we've talked about this several times as well. But for us, we're very committed to tracking the outcomes pre to during SAMA, as well as post-SAMA, what happens to workers long-term in terms of their career trajectory and their income earning power. And so we actually have signed a randomized control trial with IPA starting this year, where we're trying to academically understand what is the impact of the impact sourcing industry. And so we're really excited with this partnership to provide more rigorous academic impact on the financial outcomes. All right.
Okay, so I am going to try to address now the bad and the ugly of microworking. As you have heard, microwork, when it appeared, held a promise to address youth unemployment. And for us in this field, the lack of job creation in the local economy is sometimes a huge, unsurmountable problem. Microwork held the promise to bring jobs from clients that are in other markets to the local economy. So why is it that there is not more investment, more research, more growth in this area? A few years back, several funders such as the World Bank, MasterCard Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, really went gung-ho about microwork and impact sourcing and poured some of the resources both in research and in implementation, supporting some of the service providers. However, recently we don't see the same enthusiasm. In fact, one of the interviewees told us that they are afraid that microwork might be creating digital sweatshops. So let's look at some of the challenges. In the report, we examine 8 major challenges. I will try to address 3 or 4 of them, and I would ask then our guests also to comment on that. Microwork should be considered in the broader field of independent work and gig economy. There is definitely a vulnerability of low-skilled independent workers and risk of worker exploitation. There are no clear benefits, social protections for these workers. The pay is low and unregulated. There is race to the bottom because employers, the end clients, not employers, the service providers, but the end clients might be moving to a new country where the rates are lower and they can experience more of cost savings. Governments don't like microwork and independent work because most of them don't have proper tax laws to address this new modality of work. So some of the excellent providers like DDD and SamaSource have found ways how to address these challenges, how to provide additional benefits to workers and protect them from exploitation, and at the same time maintain their cost effectiveness and quality of service delivery toward their clients. So I would like you to maybe highlight how did you achieve this, and you are the role models for others.
Sure. Can I go first?
Sure. Yeah.
So, what we tell our clients is, look, we are not for everybody. Okay. So, if corporations are looking for the cheapest solution, the most economical solution, then oftentimes we say, look, we have a social obligation. This is our program. This is how our costs work. This is the support we provide to our employees. So we will give you, we will give you an attractive pricing, and we'll give you an attractive economic model. But if you're looking for like the cheapest vendor in town, then we're sorry, we're not a good fit for you. Okay. So we make that very clear that, look, we'll be economical. We'll be probably in the middle of the price range. We wouldn't be the highest or anything. We'll be in the middle. We'll give you good value. But if you're looking for the cheapest, cheapest solution, then very often, then we're not the people. And we explain very transparently as well that, look, this is what we do with our teams. We provide them insurance. We provide them scholarships. We provide them education. We provide them with financial sort of saving products that they can access to. We provide them with third-party, financing options as well. So, I think the more, I would say, committed people in the market, they get that model. And I think that's also been a challenge for us from a scalability perspective, is that, how do you thread the needle in terms of being able to meet our clients' commercial needs while at the same time being true to your social mission? And, the way we look at it is that, look, the first generation of microwork that happened, where it was low scale, mostly, sort of commoditized type, work that was done. I think that model has reached a certain stage of maturity. And for us, the way we try and define it is that, look, what is this next generation of skills where they are much more in demand, where we can, offer, I would say, 3 to 5x more earning potential. And the challenge is for us to figure out, what those skill sets are that can be taught to these at-risk populations, and then offer them to the market where there is a much more, I would say, demand and supply, where the gap between demand and supply is a lot more, which allows you to be, stickier in your pricing. You get more money for the amount of work that you put in, and consequently your social mission also gets sort of taken care of. So I think, we make it very clear that, look, if it doesn't work for us, then we're probably not a good fit for you, and a lot of clients, respect us for that. So we've lost quite a few, I would say, deals as well because of this mission. But at the same time, the people that we work with are committed to our social mission, yet we're providing them with a good commercial service?
Thanks, Sameer. From the Samosaurus end, one of the interesting things we found in the last few years is that there's a growing social consciousness amongst the companies that are doing outsourcing. Outsourcing typically has a bad rep in the United States, and so the fact that we're already sending jobs offshore doesn't seem to go very well. So what we try to do is add a value to the outsourcing that's being done. And so especially in Silicon Valley, there's a growing trend amongst companies to have a sustainable supply chain, even amongst their vendors. And so that's where Samosaurus fits in really well. We are competitive at a market rate, so we're providing the same service that other nonprofit or other outsourcing companies are offering, but there's a social value added to that. And that's what attracts a lot of the companies to come to Samosaurus instead of traditional outsourcing companies. And so for companies, they not only get their work done, there's a CSR component, which adds a lot of benefit to them as well. And so in question to the digital sweatshops, one of the big things that Samosaurus is very much committed to, this is the core of our social mission, is to provide dignified digital work to vulnerable populations. So what does that mean? What does dignified work mean? What does a living wage mean? What does minimum wage mean? And these are questions we've actively asked ourselves and tried to understand as we're working in the different countries across the world. And so what we've taken a look at is minimum wage, and what we've found is that minimum wage is often not enough to sustain oneself at a basic standard of living. And so we've worked with economists from the World Bank and other academic institutions to understand what would it cost for a person to meet their basic necessities, and calculated a living wage so that workers are not just earning a minimum wage, which is often set by politics and national standards, but a living wage which allows them to afford basic necessities. And so that's at the core, excuse me, that's at the core of what we do. And that's what's really exciting for us, to be able to understand, not just in Kenya, Uganda, each context is different. And so being able to provide a competitive business option for suppliers or companies, and then also being able to drive that social component is what we do best. And so when you're talking about digital sweatshops, it's not just about the wage, but the worker benefits too. So providing a safe environment. One of the core things, we've recently started our owned and operated center in Nairobi. So we not only work with partner organizations to deliver our work, we've started our own center where we own the entire supply chain, and we're able to provide worker benefits such as healthcare, trainings, leadership, mentorship, even other programs that include extracurricular activities that encourage entrepreneurship. And so these are things that a traditional employer would not provide, but because of our social mission, we're able to invest in these different types of activities. And so, these are standards I would really highly encourage the industry to hold themselves up to.
Thank you. Gig economy, independent work, microwork, hyper-specialization of jobs are trends that are with us to stay. And therefore, the solution to any challenges or risks is not to pull away. It's in fact what even John McArthur told us, is that we need heavy experimentation and new innovative solutions. One proof that these trends are here to stay is that there are more and more private sector, privately owned businesses entering the space of becoming these service providers. We actually interviewed also Impact Enterprises, a for-profit company out of New York City that has delivery centers in Zambia and really providing high quality services to their clients through microwork and in very well managed projects in poor areas, not in the capital, but in poor area in Zambia. So that is one proof. If you have private providers coming into a certain space, that means there is business to have, there are clients, there is market demand, there could be more opportunity. The second proof is that recently Rockefeller Foundation conducted a research with the Bridgespan Group in United States and conservatively estimated that 25% of US workers are independent workers. and that they are at the same risks, and the lower their skills, they are more vulnerable to the same challenges that we have seen in our study on microwork. Now, what are some innovative solutions happening in United States and some other developed countries that maybe we can mimic in developing world? So for example, care.com, an organization that provides home caregivers, they just developed portable benefits for their workers, where they are basically putting aside 2 to 4% of the wage that is collected from the client into a fund, and that fund provides benefits for the workers. Another example is the Freelancers Union, a nonprofit that is in existence for a number of years and was supported initially by the Ford Foundation when they were just experimenting, has 300,000 members. And they are building they're providing a set of benefits for freelancers, and recently entered into the partnership with Uber to provide similar types of benefits to Uber drivers. On the other side, one of the challenges is this representation, worker representation, and lack of unions that are basically protecting in some way the rights of workers. We have seen some of the innovative solutions in that area too. For example, Uber is also partnering with the International Association of Machinists, and they're creating the Independent Drivers Guild to really protect the workers' globally drivers. And in South Africa, Harambee, a youth employment accelerator, is training drivers for Uber, so becoming really a service provider in that way to Uber. So there is definitely a way also how to change laws and regulations to maximize the benefit of these new work modalities while protecting the workers and also ensuring the proper standards. And lack of standards, as you, Twisha has mentioned, is another challenge that we identified. There are some service providers who are claiming they're impact sourcers, but they are actually not really careful about their social impact. They're much more focused on their profits. And I know that Sara will, from BSR will also be talking about the new Global Coalition on Impact Sourcing and their work on these standards that will protect further this field. So our overall recommendation is that instead of pulling out and being scared by some initial challenges, we need to see more investment both in research and experimentation and implementation of impact sourcing and microwork, because this field really holds the promise for low-skilled workers in developing countries, and especially with weak economies that are not having enough job creation. So I would like to open it now for some questions and answers. I'm sure you have burning issues with microwork and impact sourcing, so please feel free to raise those, and I invite you definitely to look at the report.
Yeah. Thank you. Very interesting presentation. With our youth employment program at Children International, a good percentage of our youth come from really disadvantaged academic backgrounds. They're very deficient in many ways in basic literacy and numeracy, and the technical skills, I'm perceiving the technical skills and knowledge that would be required for the kind of work you're describing simply aren't there. So I wonder, is there a space for these kids to fit into this kind of context? And what are some of your selection criteria for your programs? I mean, you must have a lot of kids applying, and how do you make sure you get the best qualified and to be the most successful? Thank you.
So I guess I'll comment first just from our research, and then we'll hear from you guys. I mean, it was actually very interesting because many of the impact sourcing providers they have very different models in how they look at qualifications, because they need to provide high quality work on one end, but at the other end they really want to apply the most and employ the most vulnerable youth. So they aren't looking for the most qualified people, because then you would be completely excluding all the people that your organization, all of our organizations are typically working with. So they are looking at who's vulnerable, do you live in a slum? Why haven't you been able to work? Is it that because your parents were supporting you, or that you truly couldn't find a job? And they're trying to go for that latter population. And so they are, in many cases, not hiring the most qualified, trying to find who is vulnerable, and then seeking to give them jobs and then training them on the job. In addition, there was a group, DeProm, that's based out of Kenya, and they're working with students. And they're trying to find students who are in university but are really struggling to pay for their school fees. And they're trying to say, okay, who's vulnerable? Okay, who might be at risk of dropping out of school, and then channeling them into this workforce. But they're not just hiring any student. They're really trying to hire the ones who are most in need of that money to continue their education. So now I'll look to DDD and Samosource to provide a little bit more example on what they do to hire the most vulnerable youth.
Sure.
Sameer, did you want to?
Yeah,
Oh,
good.
okay. So for Samosource, one of the first approaches that we take is looking at the communities that we ideally would want to target with in terms of vulnerable populations. And so most of our workforce actually have been unemployed or chronically unemployed for long periods of time. Approximately 90% have been chronically unemployed. A lot of them have never used computers in any type of setting before. Most of them have only accessed the internet through smartphones or mobile devices, or intermittently through internet cafes. And so what we've started is this digital basics course, which is a 40-hour boot camp that goes through the basics of how to use a computer, and even some job training or project-specific training that would allow them to be competitive for Samosource jobs. So that's the type of population we're really trying to target, that has some level, that has high school level graduation or certificate, and has good comprehension of English. So we typically work in countries that are English speaking, just because of the nature of the client work. We have worked with a client that was based out of Haiti, and that was in French, but there's a lot of opportunities to expand out in multiple languages. But from the startup to scale process, I think we focused on what we could easily manage and get up to a point of scale.
And I think a key point that we found is, while literacy is needed, so there is a basic educational requirement, that ICT background is not. And, that was across the board for most of the providers we interviewed.
And so one of the other things when you're talking about metrics, right, it's not just about a basic level of education. We're taking a look at multiple different metrics. We're looking at financial status. What was their earning before Samosource? And that's where we're really trying to target that lower end of the spectrum, where they're earning below a living wage standard. And so we're trying to move as many people that are earning below a living wage to above a living wage, and then increase their earning trajectory after they leave Samosource.
Sameer?
Yeah, so for us, I mean, it's fairly similar to what Samosource does. We also work with a lot of partner NGOs who, in a lot of ways, are much closer to these communities than we are. And we've sort of discussed and partnered with them on what criteria we are looking for, and what would be sort of a good cross-section of the population to go with, as long as the minimum criteria is met. So what they would do is, they would say, okay, there's, say, 100 potential candidates that we think meet your criteria, and could you, interview them and work with them, et cetera. So in a lot of ways, we already have boots on the ground where people are interviewing them. They're close to the families. They understand the household income, whether there's one earning person, two earning people, et cetera. And yeah, minimum high school graduation is definitely required. We work in Cambodia and Laos as well, where English is not a criteria for us. So those people, we look at things in terms of what do they really want to do. Many times, when students come to us where they're not interested in a university education, they just want a job. So we have deeper conversations with their family that, why would you not be interested in a university education? What is it about a 4-year program, especially if somebody's sponsoring you for it, that you would not find appealing about it. So we have a lot of those in-depth conversations as well. And our batch size is small. So one of the challenges we face is that when we look at scaling up our business 10 times to 100 times, what does that do to the quality of the incoming candidates that we go in for? How do we scale but yet be true to our initial set of criteria, and how does that criteria even change, right? What might work for a 350 incoming cohort might not work for 5,000 incoming cohort. So we constantly sort of tweaking the model. But yes, I mean, for places in Kenya, English is one of the defining criteria. Computer skills are not required. We teach them those things. And then, they're constantly evaluated through the program as well. And sometimes, we also have dropout situations where, people figure out that, look, after a couple of years, this program is not for us. So then we get into the remediation track where, like, look, what's not working, are the things that we need to be doing differently, et cetera. So we have a sort of, I think, a fairly large team that just focuses on, this entire process. It's a combination of HR, it's a combination of, M&E people, it's a combination of third-party NGOs, et cetera, who are sort of supporting this entire initiative.
We have another question? We need a microphone.
Elena.
Thank you so much. My name is Elena Heredero. I work at the Multilateral Investment Fund of the ITB Group. And I was wondering if you can share some experiences of micro work or impact sourcing in Latin America. You mentioned Haiti, but I was wondering if there are other experiences, for instance, in the English-speaking Caribbean, where youth unemployment is also very, very high. And well, in general, in Latin America, there is a lot of informality as well. So that was one question. And then the other was regarding this journey from startup to scale. I was wondering if you can also share how, the kind of the composition of the financing, if you had different types of donors coming in at different times, and also the types of partnerships that you were building along the way, if they were more with the NGO community first and later private sector or government. Thank you.
So thank you, Elena. In the Caribbean and in Latin America, we haven't seen many examples of micro work through impact sourcing, but there's definitely examples of impact sourcing through online outsourcing. For example, all the call centers that are spreading in Caribbean and in Latin America are really examples of that. And young people who are relatively low skilled, but they are definitely applying for those positions and very interested in those positions are actually a type of micro worker, if you want, because they have very limited, very highly specialized jobs, and they provide most of their services online. So they could be somehow classified under micro work. In terms of donor participation, it seems what we have seen is that any of these organizations that's supporting the workers and acting as an intermediary between the end client and the work population actually has to be sustainable based on multiple sources of funding. So usually part of their revenues come from the client. Some of it comes from possibly local tax breaks or government subsidies, and then they might have also some government funding. And maybe you can also say, I don't know exactly what is the percentage-wise, but I think the push is towards becoming more and more self-sustained, which meaning market-driven, as opposed to subsidized by government and grants, right?
I think that's exactly the point, right? And so when we were in the startup point, we really needed that investment to prove the model and to even just invest in all of the resources to make it successful. And so as we've hit that break-even point, I think the biggest success is not just the fact that we're very much market-driven and we're evolving to meet market needs. So even the type of work is changing as the market is changing and Silicon Valley is changing. But in terms of investment, donor dollars are very important to us, especially in the startup phase. And they still continue to be, as we're also trying to do more innovative things. We're trying new ideas. We're expanding to new geographies that traditionally would not be a place that we would go into. And so we consider these to be R&D, like a research and development or even piloting phase that most traditional businesses would not take a risk to go to. So for example, what you saw in the video with Getty Images, we partnered with Oxfam Novib and the Dutch Postcode Lottery to go into Gulu, Uganda, which is a region in northern Uganda and didn't have reliable internet access. So even bringing infrastructure as well as the jobs is a big task. And so being able to prove the concept, as it works in an urban setting as well as in other settings, it does require that public-private partnership.
And Ancestry.com actually did work in Latin America. They got a large cache of records and documents from Mexico, and they needed it transcribed to be able to put on their website. This was in 2014. And so they did pilots with a number of impact sourcing organizations, including both Samasource and DDD. And while there were some challenges, they were very much testing this model and how it could be used in Latin America. And I think our report finds that across the board, language, while it's currently a constraint, is a tremendous opportunity for growth. And many of the clients we talked about said that if Microwork through an impact sourcing approach could be done in other languages, that there could be more work. But right now, it really is pretty much limited to English. I know some of the iMerit and a few other groups in India are doing it in local languages in India. I don't know if you, Sameer, want to quickly comment on some of the work you did with Ancestry.com.
Yeah, sure. So, many of you might be familiar with Ancestry. I mean, essentially, this is a genealogical database and one of the largest in the world. So what DDD does for them is, basically does the tagging, and it does the sort of searching, indexing, those kind of capabilities it adds to the database, which actually allows Ancestry to be successful. The other thing we do is, you have all these records which are hundreds of years old in hard copy and paper. So what we do is we scan those documents, and then we sort of do data entry, and we basically move them from print to digital, which allows them to be searchable and sortable and those kind of things. So it's been a multi-year project, and Ancestry has been sort of a great partner for us. And similarly, so that generated employment for about 4 to 5 years for about 300 odd people across DDD. So we're looking for some of these sort of larger partners who invested for the long term. And these are sort of, many of these are like, you could call them, our anchor partners. Like we then go to our donor community and also, go with these partners as well to say, look, this model is sustainable. There are these large organizations helping us achieve that sustainability. And now what we're finding is, once we reach the break-even point, which would be sometime this year, we're already seeing interest from, private equity financing. We're looking at some potential debt instruments as well that we can then, demonstrate the fact that, look, we're sustainable, we're commercial, and now, help us get to the next stage. So like I mentioned earlier, the donor community is, again, sort of looking at us from a different lens, and they're pushing us to be more ambitious, and the kind of funding that they're looking to us for and the kind of expectations that they have from us are also quite different.
Now, for the Latin American, Caribbean, obviously in the global labor market, those workers command higher rates than some of the workers in Africa. And so therefore, they might not be competitive for these international deals. However, if the client was in Latin America and the workers and service providers were in the same region, that could work. That could be also an opportunity for low-skilled workers to learn these digital skills and transition into better jobs.
So we have time for one more question. We need the microphone. Oh, sorry. All right, let's take both of the two questions and we'll answer them together. Great.
Okay, sure. Thank you. I have two questions. The first one is, how translatable is this model to micro-entrepreneurship? Because what I've heard so far relates more to, I think, the digital economy. And then the second question has to do with definitely, companies will move to markets where, as you mentioned, they'll have greater cost savings. So as part of your social mission, how do you help your, employees once you know that maybe a job or contract is kind of coming to an end and you might be moving on to a newer market to transition onto newer opportunities?
I'll make it really quick. I'm just curious if governments are any of your clients, or if that's sort of the direction you might be moving in terms of open government and a lot of governments moving towards more digital platforms. Okay, perfect.
Go
And then
ahead.
we have one in the back.
And one in the front.
Goes to Twisna. During your presentation, you said that your program starts from cities and towns, but we know that most of the villages are where most vulnerable people are. Why do you start your program from the cities and towns before maybe going to the villages?
So maybe we can just do rapid fire just
Yeah.
down the line. So governments, I think they haven't been, our general finding from the study was that they are not being as utilized and engaged as clients, and that is, again, a tremendous area, an opportunity for growth in this industry, and something a lot of different service providers said is an area where they see an opportunity for scale. Anyone else want to comment on the government issue?
No, I think there's a tremendous value and opportunity with government clients as well. It traditionally hasn't been the first, go-to, but as we expand and as there are more opportunities, even in collaboration with agencies that are working with vulnerable populations like refugees, there's a lot of opportunity to collaborate there.
Micro-franchising, micro-entrepreneurship, micro-certifications, micro-credentialing, micro-tasking all have many common issues that lead to new models of education and training. And I think that you are bringing an important point where we should bring these different maybe researchers and implementers in the same room and have them talk to each other and find common lessons.
An interesting anecdote related to that is Crowdflower, which is traditionally for almost independent freelancers doing this work all over the world. They found that, for example, as the situation has gotten worse in Venezuela, the usership and the worker base from Venezuela has really grown. And so now Venezuelan workers are one of their biggest worker pools as people are adopting this as a coping mechanism. More on the individual level, they're not organized in a center or by a provider, but people are using this to supplement income as the crisis has worsened. So I think there is potential.
So for the cities and towns versus going to the villages, absolutely, your premise is valid. For DDD, we had to start somewhere. And, for us, it was the cities where we wanted to first prove the business model out. The other challenge is that we're seeing that as we go into the villages, the infrastructure issues start becoming bigger and bigger. So we're looking at a couple of creative models where we're looking at satellite franchises or something, and also looking at different types of work where work can be done locally instead of having to serve international clients.
And I think government as a client is a very interesting concept because building e-governments like Kenya, the digitization of public records is a huge opportunity. Why not give those jobs to actually your own people who are disadvantaged and solve two problems at the same time? It's not as easy as it appears. It's logical, but it's not as easy.
Well, the procurement process, too, is quite a arduous task. But in response to the cities versus towns, I think I agree with Sameer, right? It's the challenge of the infrastructure and even cost of doing business, as John McArthur was talking about earlier, right? There's a big need in investment in infrastructure, and if your work is being transferred through the internet, you need reliable internet to be operational and provide work at a quality and timeliness that clients expect. And so the first natural fit would be a city and town to prove your concept and then move outwards. And so the example with Gulu, Uganda, we've managed to do both, and we're really proving it as a concept that we can then replicate elsewhere. And so we currently train and hire, we have a workforce of 100 people that are working out of northern Uganda.
And there are service providers like DeProm and Cloud Factory that don't have as much of a center-based approach. They have more of a remote worker approach where it's a network. So as long as their workers dispersed had access to a computer and internet, they could be in a rural position. So there are different models, and we had DDD and Samosaurus that both have a center-based model, but that there are other implementers who have a remote model that could address some of these constraints about towns versus rural areas.
Well, just one of the concerns around an independent model versus a managed workforce. I mean, for larger clients that are enterprise clients, and to answer one of your questions around how do you manage work volumes is exactly this, right? Having a centralized place where not only you can get the work done, but you can train the workforce. So a lot of clients require iterative tasks, a lot of improvements on the workflow. And so being able to adapt and cater to that need is a component of our model and why we find that centralized model works better. But yes, especially in rural areas where you might not have as much training and might need more one-on-one coaching, having a center works a lot better.
So basically, benefits and opportunities outweigh the challenges and risks. So Lis, you win.
And we'll all be around after the event if you have more follow-up questions.